everybody. It's Professor Michalsen here. I just recorded this whole thing without recording. I don't know what happened. So this is my second go around. I hope you guys are all doing well and that you're plenty warm. It's very cold here in Brooklyn. And I have to go out and finish some Christmas shopping, so I'm going to bundle up. So everybody's doing a good job on the discussion boards. In particular, the Welcome to Human Trafficking discussion board is lively, and I think that's great, so keep at that. Let's keep getting to know each other and giving tips to each other. The History of Slavery discussion board is getting there. A lot of people have been working really hard on contributing, though there's a number of you who haven't started yet, so you need to get to work. Don't fall behind, or else you find yourself in big trouble at the end of the semester, okay? If you need help, if you find yourself falling behind, send me an email and we can work it out, okay? And some of you have also continued to start working on the newest discussion boards on measurement, which is what I'm going to talk about now, and corrupt guardians, who's responsible for human trafficking, all sorts of stuff. In particular, Stephanie Figueroa and Catherine Job have been killing it. You're doing a beautiful job, so everybody needs to keep up with them, all right? Yeah, keep up with the discussion boards, guys. Keep at it, okay? So, what I wanted to talk to you about today is the measurement of human trafficking. As you should know as Justice Studies and Women and Gender Studies majors, the measurement of something is incredibly important. How we measure something changes the numbers that we come up with, and the numbers that we come up with change everything. It changes how we advocate about something. It changes how we make laws about something. It changes whether we care about something or not. The measurement of something may sound boring. It may sound like the number crunching thing that we don't need to worry about, but it has huge implications. Try to think real critically about how important measurement is and the successes and failures that we've had so far measuring human rights violations more generally and human trafficking more specifically. So, what I'd like to focus on first is the concept of the importance of a definition. Before we can measure anything, we have to decide how we're going to define it. You could define something one way and get one number, and define something in a different way and get a totally different number. I'm going to give you an example. I can't remember whether any of you were in my very, very first semester of teaching research methods at Montclair. I don't think so, but maybe you were, I don't know. But my very, very first semester teaching at Montclair State University, I taught a class on research methods. And coming in, I thought that was going to be the easiest class in the world to teach. I love research methods. I think it's really, really interesting and important. And so I walked in thinking everybody was going to share my belief about that. Well, I couldn't have been more wrong. I went in there all excited, engaged, and my students were just bored all the time and confused. And so, well, let me tell you about this classroom. I was on the first floor of Partridge Hall. For those of you who know Partridge Hall, there were all these windows. There was a whole wall of windows right on the first floor, so everybody was walking by all the time. And you know what my students did? Instead of looking at me while I was talking about research methods that I thought was so interesting, they were looking out the window. All the time, looking out the window, seeing if they knew anybody, seeing if anybody was cute, whatever it was. Well, finally one day I decided, you know what, if you can't beat them, join them. So I put together this activity. I said, you want to look out the window? Fine, let's look out the window. We're going to learn about some of this stuff you don't need to know. Inter-rater reliability and operationalization. Things you'll learn in research methods if you haven't taken it already. And statistics. But the concept of operationalization is important here. In research methods, operationalization is how are you going to define what you're measuring to make it clear how to measure it. So, for example, I ask students to measure school spirit. One of the things I had them measure was school spirit. But different students decided to define that in different ways. Some students decided to define it as somebody who looked excited to be at school that day, and other people decided that it meant that somebody had some sort of MSU gear on, a sweatshirt or a t-shirt or a bag or a binder or something. As you can imagine, the people with the different definitions came up with totally different numbers. One student said, oh, I saw 130 people with school spirit, and somebody else said, really? I only saw 10. So the way that we defined it became very important to coming up with the numbers in the end. The other thing that's difficult too is some students, I was a little tricky with them about it because they'd been staring out the window the whole semester, so I was tricky. Some students decided to count people within their full range of sight. Anybody that they could see, as far as their eyes could see, they counted them. Other students decided to sort of count people within only a very small space. As you can imagine, those two people, for example, came up with very, very different numbers. So how we decide to define what we're doing, what we're measuring, and where we're measuring it and how we're measuring it changes our results really dramatically. So how does this apply to human trafficking? How is this not a research methods class? Well, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, law that we're going to talk about a lot over the course of this semester, decided to define human trafficking in a very specific way so that measurement could be made universal, so that anybody who was deciding to measure human trafficking could use these definitions so we could get some comparable numbers. I'm going to read you this definition, okay? The TVPA, Trafficking Victims Protection Act, defines severe forms of trafficking as A, sex trafficking in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion. We're going to be hearing that a lot this semester. Force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years of age. B, the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. Those are terms that you should remember from our discussion of history of slavery. Now, important to know, the TVPA does not require that someone be physically transported from one place to the next for a crime to fall within those definitions. So we often think of trafficking as moving people, but it does not require movement of people. So the first definition is basically saying someone is getting paid for sex, but they are being forced, frauded, or coerced into doing that. Or that someone is getting paid for sex and they're under 18 years of age, which, as anyone knows who's in justice studies or should know in justice studies, it means that you are not capable of making an adult decision like that. And we'll talk a lot about that when we talk about sex trafficking. And then the second piece is again, using force, fraud, or coercion to get people to make things for you or do things for you that constitutes these forms of unfree labor, as we've discussed, but does not necessarily require transportation from one place to the next. So now that we have a definition, we are free to start measuring, right? That's the easy part? Not so much. As you'll see, and as you probably read in the last Go and Grow Magna article, there are huge ranges in the estimates of the number of people who are trafficked. I'm going to talk to you a bit about the Trafficking in Persons report that's put together by the State Department of the United States. What the Trafficking in Persons report, the TIP report, says is that the range of estimates goes anywhere from 4 million people to 27 million people in in positions of being forced to work unfree labor at any one time. That's a huge range, absolutely gargantuan range. The one that the estimate that the Trafficking in Persons report relies upon is one from the International Labor Organization, which is a part of the United Nations, the UN. And the ILO, the International Labor Organization, is focused on creating and enforcing labor standards, so work standards for people internationally, and protecting people against being exploited for labor. The ILO estimates that just over 12 million people, 12.3 million people, are in forced labor, bonded labor, forced child labor, and sexual servitude at any given time. The U.S. government has also worked on creating estimates. The U.S. government in 2006, the U.S. government sponsored a research project in 2006 that found that about 800,000 people are trafficked across national borders for trafficking. That is less common than people trafficked within their own countries. The vast majority of people who are trafficked within their own national borders. The majority of the people who are trafficked across national borders, about 80%, are women and girls, as far as we know. And up to 50% of them are minors. These are people who are trafficked across national borders. The people who are trafficked transnationally, across national borders, are usually trafficked into commercial sexual exploitation, so prostitution, forced prostitution, but those are obviously not the only people who are trafficked for the purposes of sexual exploitation, commercial sexual exploitation. Many, many millions of people are trafficked within their own national borders for those purposes, both men and women, boys and girls. Females are not the only people who are used for commercial sex. So, let's see, the Trafficking in Persons report put together by the State Department uses a whole range of different methods to pull together data about human trafficking. They use information from foreign governments who may be recording data themselves about human trafficking, also from U.S. embassies in other countries. They rely quite a lot on non-governmental organizations, also called NGOs. We'll talk a lot about them over the course of the semester. Oh, my mail is here. Yay, maybe Christmas cards. The State Department takes trips to regions to investigate governmental compliance with standards fighting human trafficking. And there's also an email address where non-governmental organizations and governments can submit information, TIP report at state.gov. You can send an email into the State Department to share information about governmental progress in different regions about fighting trafficking. And that's one of the things that I think is very important for you to realize. The TVPA, Trafficking Victims Protection Act, required that different countries be placed on into a tier system. Technically, it's a 3-tier system, but as you'll see, there's really actually 4 tiers. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this tier system. Each country is placed on a tier. It's important to remember, tier placement is not based on how bad the problem of human trafficking is in a particular country. Tier placement is actually, no matter how important that is, tier placement is actually based on how much is the government of that country working to fight human trafficking. So important to remember that tier placement is not that something is going on necessarily horribly in that country, but it's about government work to fight the problem. So let me read to you the tier requirements. So the State Department works first to evaluate whether the government complies with the TVPA's minimum standards for combating trafficking and eliminating trafficking. Governments that fully comply are placed on Tier 1.